Greetings, fellow travellers, and welcome to The Way of the Showman, where we view the world through the lens of showmanship. I am Captain Frodo, and I will be your host and your guide along the way. It's great to have you back here with me, and I am going to look forward to this episode here today, where we're going to talk about neoteny, which is a mouthful, and anyway, that's why I called it We Are the Children. What does that mean? Well, you just have to stick around to find out, won't you? So last episode, we talked about relaxed field. We talked about love and how love created the ability for a child to exist within a relaxed field where they can do things not just to survive, but they can do things that they do to be able to do exactly what they want. And what do they want? Well, turns out we just want to have fun. We want to play. We want to have a good time. So that's in a nutshell what we talked about last time. And we talked about how play then actually affords freedom. When we play and we are afforded freedom by our parents first, and then perhaps by the tribe and so forth, then we are given the opportunity to be more ourselves. We can become more individuals. That's the basic key thing. Time frees up, and you can spend more time asking the big questions, or whatever you will do with that time that you have been given. Because, as Tolkien says, all we can do is to decide what to do with the time that is given to us. And on that note, let's jump straight into today's world of ideas. We are the children, as the song said. And what does that mean? Well, that is what we're going to unpack here today. And I thought a good place to start is where this whole season 4 started, with repeating the poem My Heart Leaps Up by William Wordsworth. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began, and so is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man. And I wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. William Wordsworth, My Heart Leaps Up. Yeah, that phrase, the phrase from Wordsworth's poem, the child is the father of the man, which also means, of course, the child is the mother of the woman. Because what it actually means is that it's from the child that we shall find the adult. So my own rephrasing of that was as the kid is the man. The child is the father of the man, or the kid is the man. And this has been one of those nuggets of poetic wisdom that has been with me since my early 20s. So much so that when I made my first email address in 1999, it was thekidistheman@hotmail.com. So that I would have it as a part of my daily existence was the idea. Although I did not deeply connect this phrase with neoteny, which is what we're going to talk about today, at that time, but it certainly seems to beautifully point towards it in the rich multi-layered meanings that we find so readily in great poetry. That meaning, the child is the father of the man, that seems to carry in it, at least one explanation of it, is this whole neoteny that we're going to talk about today. Now, when I read this poem, it describes the kind of romantic notions of nostalgia and sentimentality in the best possible way, but also it brilliantly encapsulates the process of neoteny. So, what is neoteny? Well, our species' evolutionary story has been powerfully shaped by the fact that human beings have retained juvenile features into adulthood. The process that makes this happen is called neoteny, or juvenilization. What makes it happen is a kind of delaying or slowing of the physiological developments of an organism, like typically of animals, It can be any one, but it's any childlike features that becomes that remains visible in the physiology or in the behavior in any kind of development of the organism. So, childlike features into adulthood. And I first heard of neoteny from my biology teacher in year 12 at school. And back then I don't know if I quite understood it. That is, I understood what he told us, and scored very well on my tests and wrote extensively and well beyond what was required for the subject. And I know that because I have moved back to Norway, and I have found the box of school books that I have there. Because in the Steiner school, the Waldorf school, the teaching is done by the teacher lecturing, standing in front of the students. He is facing the other way. In this case, it was him, a man, and we students facing him like an audience. We were taking notes, and from those notes, then we compose a synopsis of the class, and then we transfer this by hand into a paper book. And this empty book is then slowly being filled by our writing. That is, our understanding of what has been said in class. So the book then becomes our school book. It's in this that it is this book that we refer back to when we prepare for tests. And the book also serves then as a much more detailed reflection of how well each student actually has understood the subject. Not just from the finished product, but from the interactions that you have with the teacher in shaping the contents of the book. So the teacher asks questions and watches your notes, and then the transferal and fleshing out of those notes into longhand texts. And along this way, the teacher, through conversation, comments, and general social intelligence, grasps how you feel about the subject, what you understood and what you didn't grasp. And in short, they get a much expanded idea of your relationship and mastery of any given subject compared to just the results of the test at the end of it. So when I look at my book on the subject of evolution, which, as I said, I recently found in my sister's basement, I see that I completely filled one book and then almost wrote out the second one. And this is quite unusual from looking at the stack of books. Usually it fits inside one book. And I see that the notes from the teacher commenting on the longer bits of text that I have done has gone outside the spoken lectures for the content of the lectures that the teacher held. And I can, now reading back some of these things, I can see that I have a very naive and limited grasp of the material. Yet it is blindingly obvious that I have found a topic that sparked a fire in me. So I was writing out and waffling on and about this. So from this 3-week lecture series back in 1994, a lifelong interest was found. And I find that's an interesting thing thinking back at it now, because although some of it is just I'm making up and I'm drawing parallels and saying, this makes me think of this and this makes me think of that. And when I joined a university course the year after, studying philosophy and all that, and I think I've said that before on this podcast, the teacher that we had in philosophy history, he said, oh, well, remember when you guys are writing the assignments that we don't want your thoughts. We just want the thoughts of the thinker that you're talking about. And I remember being so angry about that. But then again, the teacher sort of said, well, the main reason for that is that you think you're having new ideas and don't waste your time on this, because a lot of the time you might be thinking you're philosophizing something out and haven't had some great insight, and then when you get the paper back, the teacher might say, well, if you want to explore that idea, you should read the works of this guy, and in general you should read this section of the library, because that is about that idea that you're now barely scratching at. So I can understand why they said that, but I came out of this school then, the Steiner school, the Waldorf school, where the teacher was absolutely encouraging me to think through these thoughts and get to the limits of my own knowledge and ask these questions and that, and he was really seeing the value in that. And perhaps that too is then what was part of sparking my interest. My lifelong interest, which has led me to recording this episode for you here today. So maybe this is just an example that might make that little metaphorical bell ring again and see, here we have an example of showmanship that can change someone's life. Maybe it didn't change it so much, but it certainly helped guide out this course so that many years later, after having some in-depth conversations with this girl that I was hanging out with, and she was pointing me towards the writings of Stephen Jay Gould, and thus I started picking up reading evolution again, long after I was finished school, reading the brilliant essays of Stephen Jay Gould, and then finding it hard to get a comprehensive overview of it, I read some of the books of Richard Dawkins, and before you know it, here I am, and this wasn't supposed to be autobiographical, so let's get back into the topic of we are the children. We, like how neoteny, how the childlike features has retained into our adulthood, and how all-encompassing this actually is. So, well, anyway, at the time, when I was writing all this stuff, I didn't quite understand the ramifications and the scope of neoteny, and I understood that neoteny was about how certain animals kept certain traits from their childhood after they had grown up. I can see that that's what I was writing about, and it is also the study of how organisms retained these juvenile features. Like, why has it happened? And an often cited example is the axolotl. This odd-looking creature with 6 almost sun-ray-looking fluffy gills radiating from their heads with this vaguely smiling expression is a kind of salamander, axolotl. Most salamanders start their lives as a larvae, living in water, and then they sprout legs and continues life as land dwellers, much like how tadpoles sprout legs and then move on to living on land as frogs. The axolotl, though, starts as a larvae, sprouts legs, but then skips the step of moving onto land. So that means that it has retained the juvenile trait of living in water into adulthood. So, I mean, there's a lot more weird stuff going on with axolotls, but those are stories that you need to seek out for yourself. Because we are not going to talk in depth about the axolotl, although there's all sorts of animals where it has these cool traits of how they've taken a juvenile trait and persisted into adulthood, and how that has completely altered their life. But the animal that we're going to talk about is the fox, the Arctic fox. And this is sometimes called the Great Fox Experiment, or I'm going to call it that anyway. And this is actually, it's very famous and extremely long-running experiment. It started in 1958 and is still running as I write this in 2023. And as I am telling you this now, in 2024, it's still going. So this experiment started out on a remote silver fox farms in the far reaches of Siberia. A student called Lyudmila Trot was asked by her professor, Dmitri Belyaev, I think actually it's pronounced, Dmitri Belyaev. I have since, after writing this many times, I have then found an audiobook and got to listen to that name. So that's the professor who asks the student, Lyudmila, whether she wanted to help him with an experiment. And Dmitri told her that they were going to attempt to improve the production of fox pelts. And Lyudmila said yes, and very soon the two developed a deep respect for each other, which made Dmitri having to tell Lyudmila then that he had actually lied to her. They were working with silver foxes in Siberia, but the real goal was not to find ways to make better pelts or to make foxes have more pups. The real purpose was to see if they could turn a fox into a dog. And it might be hard for us to imagine why Belyaev would have to lie about something like that. And to be able to understand that, we have to remember that this was in 1958, and Russia was only one part of the vast expanse of the Soviet Union. And during this time, the state-sanctioned biology, and yes, they had such a thing, where just like, which to us today can seem odd. the biology at that time was called Lysenkoism, and this was the invention of Trofimo Lysenko, which was a farm boy that rose in the ranks of the Communist Party and of Soviet science, in part because of his unique socialist take on biology. His form of biology is more of a political campaign, where doctrines like grain and plants would be planted very close together, following his own law of the life of species. So the plants meant that plants from the same class, he said, plant from the same class, which is of course the wording from the political stuff here. He said that the plants from the same class, they never competed with each other. So you could plant these plants very close together and they would all give room for each other. For such it was of the different classes. But the result of this particular thing, the law of life of species, which he formulated, and all the other kinds of changes that Lysenko proposed to agriculture, the result of that was not a brotherhood of plants. It was crop failure, and the result of it was widespread famine, because obviously, the plants who were planted too close, they just died, because the law of the life of species wasn't, maybe it just wasn't understood by the plants. And a result of the failing of the crops on a massive scale then turned into widespread famine across the Soviet Union, contributing to the death of millions of people. In the same year as Dmitri and Lyudmila began their experiment, Lysenkoism was adopted by the People's Republic of China, and so that was also then in 1958, and this was also then what started in 1958. In 1959 to 1961, this was what is now called the Great Chinese Famine. And it's widely regarded as the deadliest recorded famine and one of the greatest man-made disasters in human history. So to say that the practical application of Lysenko's theories were disastrous is a bit of an understatement. So this is just an example of what happens when you mix ideology with biology. This is why, though, this is a little bit of a long, as by now, more than 100 episodes into this thing, then you know that I have a tendency to go deep into these things. And what we're basically trying to understand here is, why did Belyaev have to lie about what the whole purpose of this great fox experiment was? Well, Lysenko's ideas, when they were made official state biology, that meant that any alternative biologies, like the evolution by natural selection and the whole field of genetics, they became forbidden to study. So as evolution was deemed a lie propagated by the capitalist West, that was basically what they said. So huge gap in understanding of agriculture as well then. So Dmitri Belyaev's fox experiments into domestication were essentially then experiments in genetics, very much like the monk Gregory Mendel's research on domesticated peas, which was the first. Gregory Mendel was the first to demonstrate that genetic traits were transferred from one plant via their seed to the next. And although Mendel did his experiments before anyone knew anything about the existence of genes, it is still genetic research. And in 1948, genetics were banned in Russia. So that's even before Lysenko there. And genetic institutions were closed, and the information on genetics was removed from textbooks. Thus, the silver fox taming experiment was illegal. And how illegal, you might ask? Well, enough so that it got Dmitri's brother Nikolai, who had been a prominent researcher in population genetics, it made him get arrested by the state of police, and then shortly thereafter, so he was executed without ever having been in any kind of trial. So, pretty illegal. So that's why he had to keep this on the down low until he really knew that he could trust Lyudmila. And Lyudmila Trot, she's in many ways like the real hero of this story. She was already committed to the cause of the foxes, and she had very quickly taken a deep interest in these foxes in the middle of the Siberia, out on this fox farm, and living, she dedicated her life to it. And Belyaev, or Dmitri, as I'm calling him now, because we're on first name, he could then tell her that the true nature of the research project, he could tell her what that actually was. And although it's true that dogs can have 2 litters of puppies each year, and that silver foxes can only have 1. This wasn't really the main point of interest for Dmitri, but it was a great excuse. So what he was wondering about was why domesticated animals all seem to share similar features. Animals like pigs, rabbits, and sheep have remarkable similarities when viewed alongside of their wild ancestors. They're all a little smaller, and that includes the size of their brain and teeth. So dogs have 15% smaller craniums than wolves. Guinea pigs, 15% smaller than their wild counterparts. And interestingly, bonobos have about 15% smaller brains than chimpanzees. And finally, we're going to talk more about bonobos, and if you don't know the exact difference between a chimpanzee and a bonobo, then that's definitely worthwhile going and finding a documentary about it on YouTube. Bonobos are truly remarkable beings. And finally, it is also approximately the average size difference between a modern human and a Neanderthal. Neanderthals actually had bigger brains than us. And of course, up until relatively recently, it was a very strict kind of division saying that, well, we are like, they're cousins, and Neanderthals are cousins of us, and we aren't actually related. But over the last, I would say, maybe the last 10 years, but maybe a little earlier, but certainly it hasn't become part of popular science until the last decade or so. We all have some Neanderthal DNA in us, quite a few percentage actually, and pretty much everybody does, as far as I understand, maybe excluding people who have stayed mainly within Africa. So seems like people came out of Africa, and then somehow they started interbreeding with the Neanderthals. But this I know very little of. I'm by no means any expert, but we are actually more closely related to Neanderthals than what we previously thought. So back to what is it that happens when you domesticate something that is the same. So it's clear now that the brain, the fact that when something gets tamed or domesticated, seems to have this 15% thing here, seems to be something that goes that we see again and again. So that is a pattern. But other common shared features of tame species are floppy ears, curly tails, and noise making, like how dogs bark and yap and whine, and wolves are almost completely silent if they aren't screaming at the moon. But the bleating of sheep and mooing of cows too is something that we don't find much in their wild counterparts. And so, as I mentioned, like wolves, they do howl, but they don't bark and vocalize like dogs after they mature, whining and doing all those things. Not to the same degree. And the same goes for foxes, which are most pertinent for our exploration. And that is that the fact that the domesticated species, this is not just for foxes, but for all of it, it's like the most important fact to take is that domesticated species often retain juvenile traits for their whole life. So the animals that do well with being domesticated are the ones that seem to retain a little bit of their young traits. So all of our farm animals are the result of domestication or selective breeding. And that means that a human being has looked at his herd and then found the animals which they deem to have the best features, like a male and a female sheep, which has particularly nice wool, and then they've mated those two in hope of getting lambs with equally excellent wool, possibly even better. So the thing, though, that didn't make any sense to Dmitri Belyaev, it was that all these ancient farmers, they seemed to then, like, they were breeding for wool or whatever, but at the same time, if it was true that it was only this that had made the animals, when you breed them for the wool, why was it then that the ancient farmers back in the day, they seem to all have specifically preferred corkscrew tails and droopy ears and baby faces? Why have they bred them so that these juvenile features would continue in their stock? Why did all of our ancestral breeders of animals prefer animals that looked cute and juvenile? Well, Dmitri Belyaev had a hunch that they hadn't selected specifically for any of those traits, but that all of these features were byproducts of something else. So this is the big hunch here that is gone, well, they were probably breeding for the wool, but the fact that the sheeps were bleating and that they were baaing and that they were staying close and being in a herd and being more playful, or so that these things weren't what the farmers back in the ancient times had actually been selecting for. He believed that the one trait that brought with it all these other cutesy things and kid-like things, he thought that this was tameness. He thought that if you selected only the tame animals, you would get animals that looked like puppies. And in this very specific case, with the great fox experiment, he thought that if you only selected the tame foxes for breeding, then you would only get not only get tamer foxes, but you would get those tame foxes in a shape that would begin to look like juveniles, or more specific for him here, they would begin to look like dogs. Dmitri Belyaev hoped to be able to tame the foxes and to start seeing results in maybe as little as 20 generations of foxes. So, Lyudmila Trot got to work on selecting foxes. And in her book that she co-wrote with Lee Dugatkin, she describes, which is the one that I actually listened to as an audiobook, and it's a brilliant book, which is called How to Tame a Fox. And in the book, she describes that even though she was prepared for the silver foxes to be aggressive, she still was surprised by their astonishing ferocity. Wearing leather gloves that were several centimeters thick and went up past the elbow, she would approach them in their cages and select the ones that showed even just a delay in attacking. It wasn't, by that point, it wasn't showing any tameness. It was just, if they hesitated at all, this was grounds for selection in the early rounds. And then they were mated. They found a female and a male who delayed their response in attacking. There was just this moment of hesitation before they bit into the thick gloves. So then they were mated, and the same selection process was then done with the litters of pups. So the ones that showed any sign of tameness or tolerance of her presence were selected to have their own pups, and Lyudmila had been prepared that this work might actually never be completed within her career, since they only have one set of pups a year, so it's a slow process. But then, to her, it was a complete surprise when one of the foxes from the 4th generation of foxes began to wag its tail when she approached it. 4 years it took, not 20. They still had a long way to go, but she took this as a very auspicious sign. And to try to make sure that the foxes weren't just getting used to human contact by exposure, Lyudmila and her co-workers tried to have as little contact with the animals as possible. The thing was that this wasn't as easy. That as the experiment went on, this became very hard, because the more the foxes became like dogs, the more they craved and begged for attention, and the cuter they got. So in the wild foxes, usually they become a whole lot more aggressive at about 8 weeks of age. But this didn't happen with Lyudmila's foxes. They stayed friendly. They didn't seem to grow out of this natural childlike state of friendliness. That 8-week kind of gap where they were more playful, and even the terrible foxes, aggressive foxes, they had some delay. There was better in those first 8 weeks. So they didn't seem to grow out of this natural childlike state of friendliness. And the desire to connect and form relationships just stayed there. So, quoting from Lyudmila, saying that these tamer foxes seem to resist the mandate to grow up. And just like Dmitri Belyaev had predicted, the physical characteristics of these foxes changed too. These new fourth, fifth, sixth generation foxes had ears that drooped, tails that curled, spots appeared on their coats, and their snouts got a little shorter and their bones a little finer and thinner. And also the males, they began to resemble the females. So the experiment had been a success. An animal that's selected for its friendliness continues to look and behave like juveniles. They found that the calmest and friendliest foxes produced less of the stress hormones like cortisol and produced more oxytocin, which is kind of what's oxytocin is sometimes called a love hormone. It's what's being released in bounds between a mother and a child when you have a baby and all that. And also there's serotonin, which is a kind of happy hormone, what makes us feel good. That also comes in greater abundance in the calmest and friendliest foxes. They got less stressed, more loved up, and more happy. And so the result of this was probably a lot more complicated than that, but that you can find out about yourself in the details. But the result of this was that there's a massive delay in the adult traits. For some, the delay was so long that the adult features actually never appeared at all. And the 8-week increase in aggression, that never actually happened. So it had been delayed until after they were dead. So after working with the foxes for 20 years, much had changed in the Soviet Union. They no longer believed that evolution and genetics was a capitalist plot. In 1978, Dmitri Belyaev managed to negotiate that the International Congress of Genetics would be held in Moscow. And when he shared the results of the fox experiments, that tameness, the tameness score of the foxes had continued to increase with each generation, starting with the very first one in 1959. And then he presented the evidence to back up this original hunch that selection for tameness or friendliness would bring with it the full suite of juvenile traits. And he says, so it's that playfulness and sociability could be seen in the foxes, which by that stage, by the time in 78 when they had this, then the foxes were responding to their name when called for. And these juvenile traits were now reliably would just stay like that for the remainder throughout their life. So when Belyaev finished his talk, and just like a sort of mic drop, then he said that this thing, neoteny, the juvenile traits that goes up, it says when you tame something, when you select for friendliness and tameness, then this is not something that applies only to foxes. The theory, he said, can also, of course, apply to human beings. Badum ching, dan dan dan. So, self-domestication. Could we have self-domesticated ourselves? Huh? In an article on livescience.com called Darwin's Dark Night, scientist risked execution for a fox study, which is an interesting article about what we have just spoken about, then the evolutionary anthropologist and expert on dogs, Brian Hare, says about Belyaev and Trot's foxes that after only 45 generations, the experimental foxes began to change in ways that might take thousands, if not millions, of years in the wild. Yet, he then goes on to question the assumption that it might have taken so long. That dogs are the ancestors of the wolf is pretty incontrovertible, but there is still debate around exactly how this happened. So one of the most common lines of reasoning goes that as long ago as 23,000 years, an ancient human hunter-gatherer person found some wolf pups, and being attracted to their neoteny cuteness, their sweet juvenile features, then he brought the pups home, and thus setting in motion a long path towards domestication. And with the research and discoveries from Belyaev's foxes, we know that the whole suite of juvenile traits, the playfulness, the wagging of the tail, the response to being called for by name, can arrive at by only one criteria, namely friendliness. So Brian writes in this article that now there was a way that could increase the speed of domestication manifold and, crucially, would allow the whole process to be driven by the wolves themselves. It didn't have to be consciously instigated by a hypothetical human being deciding to domesticate the cute wolf pup and then breeding that and taking the tamest one or whatever. Now the whole process could potentially be explained by one new rich food source that became available to wolves, namely garbage. So we know that those animals, like the pigeon and the rat, like if an animal like the pigeon or the rat, if they can learn to turn down their fear of human beings, like the pigeon and the rat has done, then they get access to a vast food source, our garbage and our leftovers. Rats and mice and pigeons all allow humans to come a lot closer to them than, say, a deer or an eagle. And this gives the pigeons and rats a major survival advantage, making them very numerous indeed. And apparently there is an estimated 400 million pigeons and 7 billion rats in the world. So if we postulate that wolves smelt their way to the human garbage piles some 20,000 years ago, it's pretty clear that whichever one of those wolves that just happened to be a little less nervous, a little more comfortable with human beings being close by, would have had more access to the garbage food. So this simple fact would then lead to a self-domestication process. The tamest wolves would get most food, and their strength and vigor they would get from a steady supply of food would have given them a better chance of having many and healthy pups. And the cycle could have started much like what Lyudmila, when she selected the friendliest fox, then that whichever one of the pups in the Stone Age wolf's litter that was friendliest would get the most food. Thus, the cycle of life and selection would continue. And maybe the process wasn't as quick as 45 generations for the Siberian foxes, but even at 100 generations we have a very significant reduction in time from thousands or even millions to potentially 100 or less. So we can then draw the same conclusions about human beings, picking up on the mic drop suggestion from Belyaev. We too could have self-domesticated ourselves. The ones of us that was best at cooperation, the friendliest humans, had more chance of survival, as one human being is pretty vulnerable, but a tribe of ultra-social beings is the most formidable force on Earth. With distributed cognition, where all the members of a tribe work on a problem, and each of the members they can all be specialized in their own knowledge, and not everybody needs to know everything, but in the same way that I said, it's like, we landed on the moon. Well, I didn't take such a big part in that, but I still like to say it. We thought up human beings. We made the combustion engine and made the theory of relativity. Personally, I don't know, I didn't partake much in either of those, but as a group, we are extremely brilliant. That's not only the case for our Paleolithic ancestors. Most of us, like I just suggested, but most of us today have no idea how a smartphone works or how to make a light bulb or how a fridge works, but some of us do, and all of us can then use these technologies to do incredible things. The amount of research that can be done on a smartphone or computer when writing an essay, such as what I'm doing now, is just staggering. Yet, it does not require me to know how it works, because my ultra-social friend, who I've never met and maybe won't ever meet, has got that part under control. As a tribe, we are amazing. And Brian here makes the case in more detail in his book called Survival of the Friendliest, which is the same guy who wrote that article from before. If you didn't pick that up, he's got a great book called Survival of the Friendliest, where he talks about how we are a self-domesticated species, and that our best friend, the dog, also is a self-domesticated creature. Not just that we domesticated it, but that actually domesticated itself, giving it a whole bunch of those features that we now think of as juvenile. And that is in part why we are the children, even when we're awake, why the child is the father of the man, or the child is the mother of the woman. And thus ends today's episode a little abruptly. Snap! And we are back in because we're going to actually divide this up into 2 episodes so we don't get too much stuff about neoteny and biology. But I hope that this little excursion into the Soviet Union and Lysenkoism and all this is giving you a little bit of the flavor of how neoteny could have caught such a fire in me, and why evolution had caught such a fire in me. And I know I did a little detour there talking about both how Steiner schools function, but I hope that it at least also gave this picture of and a little bell, the metaphorical bell, little picture of how teaching is also a bit like showmanship, and how it can start a fire in someone that lasts for the rest of their life. At least in potential, you could do that with your show. And another thing that you could do for this show is to go onto the social media and tell, just to share when episodes come out. Every second week I post something on either on Captain Frodo Santini or on The Way of the Showman. And if you haven't already, go over and subscribe, and then you find these little these notices. It would be totally awesome if you just shared that the episode is out there, so that it would feature on your wall. You would do me a great favor. If you do, I'd be very happy. And that's all that I had to say. And then we pick it up next time. So until then, take care of yourself and those you love. And I hope to see you along the way in real life. That would be awesome.